So I'll be presenting just a couple of slides to kick off things, and then we'll have 3 short presentations followed by discussions like we had in the previous DOPS and PDOPS. By the way, excellent discussions, excellent presentations that we heard until now. Next slide. Okay, CKDOPPS is ongoing in 5 countries, 154 sites, and about 11,000 patients. So again, as Mark mentioned, for PDOPS, one of the largest cohorts, prospective cohort studies in patients with chronic kidney disease, with 2 peculiarities. One is a study that is really focused on nephrology care, since all participating clinics are run by nephrologists. The second peculiarity, we start to follow up a bit later than most of the cohort studies. The cutoff of GFR for our studies is less than 60 mLs per minute. And the majority of patients are actually on stage 4 and 5, non-dialysis. And that is really the characteristic of CKD care across the participating countries. The average GFR, for you to have an idea, for the data that we have at the moment in 11,000 patients, is about 25 mLs per minute, very similar across different countries. Next slide. So this is the list of our country investigators. I wanted to thank them so much for all the work that has been put to helping the design of the study, and also helping the study implementation and follow-up. Fantastic work of a large group of people. I wanted to acknowledge folks at Arbor Research that are very involved in CKDOPPS. Ron Pizzoni, Angelo Caraboyas, Murilo Guedes, Brian Beaver, and Kip McCullough. Next slide. Also, just like what was mentioned in the previous 2 presentations, this is also something that we do for CKDOPPS, sharing data with academic institutions and having data hubs so that the exploration of data is optimized. So I wanted to acknowledge the data hub in France, coordinators had by Benedict Stengel until very recently. Benedict has retired very recently, and Natalia Pinho took over as the lead for the CKDOPPS France portion of the study, which is actually done in parallel with a very nice CKD study, which is funded by public sources in France. I've been sharing data with some academic institutions in the US. I wanted to highlight the very nice work done by Chichu from the University of California in San Francisco, a study that has been funded by an NKF award for young investigators. There's also some investigator-led study on the areas of conservative management, and also in sex-specific differences that were led and funded by some grants from NIDDK and from the University of Vienna. Next slide. So again, as we transition to the presentations, let's keep the discussion active in the Q&A feature. We'll be paying attention to that and answering that, and also at the end of the 3 presentations, we're going to have some time for discussions. So enjoy the presentations, and we'll start welcoming Lisa Legal from the CKD Hunt Group. Lisa is from Bordeaux in France, and she's going to be sharing with us a very nice study that is going to be presented actually as an abstract at the ERDJ next week. It is a study looking at trajectories of hemoglobin and cardiovascular events, and this is based on the CKD, the French portion of CKD. And again, Lisa, welcome, and let's hear her presentation.
Hello, I'm Lisa Legal from Bordeaux, France, and I'm a PhD candidate in epidemiology. I'm supervised by Karine Fondré, Jérôme Aramba, and Mathilde Prézin-Redit. So I'm very glad today to present you my work that talks about hemoglobin trajectory in non-dialysis dependent chronic kidney disease and associated risk of major adverse cardiovascular events. So anemia in CKD patient is defined as in general population by an hemoglobin below 12 in women and below 13 in male. And we know that in CKD, the prevalence of anemia is high and increase with CKD progression. Also, we have international guidelines and available therapy, such as iron or EPO. The management of anemia in those days is still controversial. And there is a great heterogeneity of practice around the world. And we need to increase the knowledge about the threshold of hemoglobin associated with poor outcomes and the parameter to initiate treatment, which treatment and which targets. So why would you do that? Because anemia has been repeatedly associated with poor outcomes, especially at risk of cardiovascular events in decreased quality of life in CKD patients in numerous observational studies. But most of these studies have focused on a single measurement of hemoglobin, and very few have considered the trajectory of hemoglobin over time. So we are interested in those trajectory, and we made the hypothesis that trajectory of hemoglobin may differ between patients with CKD. So our objective was essentially descriptive, and we wanted to identify typical profile of hemoglobin trajectory in this CKD patient, to identify subpopulation of patients with a typical profile of hemoglobin, and to describe characteristics of patients in each asin class or subpopulations that we identified, and to estimate the class-specific risk of major adverse cardiovascular events. So we work with CKD cohort data that includes more than 3,000 patients with moderate to severe CKD from 40 centers in France that are representative of French outpatient nephrology care, that a major strength of CKD cohort. And patient was followed during 5 years, during which they collect lots of data, included hemoglobin, and we were interested in this repeated measure of hemoglobin. Our endpoint was composite one major cardiovascular event that was made with cardiovascular death, acute myocardial infarction, stroke, and heart failure hospitalization. And we wanted to take into account competitive risk with kidney replacement therapy and non-cardiovascular death. So we use a joint platinum class mixed model, that's a big model that allow to identify typical profile of hemoglobin trajectory, to identify specific subpopulation, and under a process, latent process, made the link with events. So this model is made with 3 type of submodel: a linear mixed model that allow to identify hemoglobin trajectory over time, a multinomial logistic regression submodel that allow to classify patients in asin classes, and 3 submodel, time to event 3 model, 1 type for event in competition. So we estimate jointly these submodels that are a good statistical propriety, and we estimate a model with 2 classes, 3 classes, 4, 5, 6, and after that we choose the best trade-off between statistical performance and clinical relevance. And after the model was estimated and chosen, we describe a posteriori the characteristic of participants in each asin classes. So we studied more than 3,011 patients, only patients with at least one measure of hemoglobin. That was almost male, median age 69, and median GFR 32 ml minutes. And we work about we work with more than 33,000 measures of hemoglobin. That was a lot. And there was 460 males during the follow-up. And here is the model. We identify 5 subpopulations of hemoglobin trajectory, and a big one profile, the green one, with a stable trajectory of hemoglobin over time that encompasses 2/3 of the population. And the other third are declining trajectory under different patterns. So here we picture the probability of event, here MACE, here the kidney replacement therapy before MACE, and here a non-cardiovascular death. Each time it's from 0 to 1, it's probability. And that we can see that it was striking to see that the green profile with stable trajectory of time are very low risk of events, and it was different, of course, for declining profile. And when we take a look at the risk of kidney replacement therapy before any occurrence of MACE, what we can see is that each time the trajectory starts to decrease, it's time that the risk starts to increase, and it was true also for death. After estimating the model, we described the characteristic in patient just to be fast. In the green trajectory profile, we had patients with less advanced CKD and patients with less comorbidity. It was not surprising, but we wanted to be sure of that. So it's the first descriptive work, and we were able to describe 5 typical profile of hemoglobin. So 2/3 of the patient had stable hemoglobin of trajectory of hemoglobin during time, and it was associated with very low risk of events. And 1/3 of the population had declining trajectory over time. And it's very encouraging to study the longitudinal association between hemoglobin and clinical outcomes in CKD patients. So I really thank you all patients and all persons that support CKD cohort. And I also want to thank you, my supervisor, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Lisa. That was a very nice presentation. I really think that the way we see and react to hemoglobin has been a very simplistic approach, as you mentioned, based on a single measure. And I think your study definitely will open opportunities for us to understand better about how to react to hemoglobin and how to monitor hemoglobin and try to develop ways of improving outcomes in these patients. So just stay there. We'll get back to the discussion after the other 2 presentations. So thanks again. So we'll move to the second presentation. And this is an important work going on in our research currently, in very, very close collaboration with Natalia Pinho, Murilo Guedes, who's a new member of the DOPPS group, and the lead together with Natalia in this project that is describing international variations in pre-dialysis care with a focus on vascular access creation and looking at some of the clinical outcomes. So let's hear from Murilo what he has to show us, and get back to discussion after the 3 talks of the session. Go ahead, Murilo.
Hello, my name is Murilo Guedes. I am a physician scientist with Arbor Research, and I'm here speaking on behalf of a full group of co-authors who worked on this CKDOPPS study investigating international variations in transition of care practices and 2-year outcomes in advanced chronic kidney disease patients. This work will also be presented as a free communication in the upcoming European Congress of Nephrology in Milan. As an important piece of background, it's important to note that the early dialysis period among patients who transition to kidney replacement therapy is a very high risk period for all-cause mortality among these patients. Classically, these outcome or these mortality rates vary a lot in different regions in the world, pointing to potential disparities either in access or in terms of practice patterns that can affect global outcomes in patients with kidney replacement therapies all over the world. When we look at other potential risk factors, so potentially associated with worse outcomes, such as vascular access placement, we also see how this practice varies in different countries in the world. And this is classically described as well by DOPPS data and other investigators. For instance, in Japan, the rate of patients receiving EV fistula is much higher than other countries in the world, like in the US or in Canada. Importantly, other investigators have shown that the access to pre-nephrology care also varies a lot in these regions, and it's also associated to worse outcomes in the early period in the transition to dialysis care. A key or some key important components of nephrology care are to assure a smooth transition into kidney replacement therapy. Several guidelines state that nephrologists, clinicians, physicians in general should be empowering patients through education so they can be independent or at least have informed decisions on the best dialysis modalities, if any, or if a patient is suitable for a transplant, or even if they would prefer going into conservative kidney management strategies. This is broadly defined as an end-stage kidney disease life plan, which should include modality decisions, conservative care management decisions, and also discussions about the best vascular access for specific patients, which may vary depending on clinical scenario and other variables. But one key component here is to assure a smooth transition to kidney replacement therapy modalities, minimizing clinical complications, at least trying to reduce the risk that we saw in the prior slides in terms of mortality incidence, and importantly, assuring that these patients have adequate quality of life as they transition into other kidney replacement modalities over time. Despite the importance of this transition period into kidney replacement therapies, we actually have a lack of data, or at least high quality data across countries, comparing the practice patterns on planning and education for kidney replacement therapy in the world. Usually, kidney replacement planning or preparation are described after patients transition into dialysis, only looking at patients who actually survived until being able to receive vascular access care or even chronic kidney disease or kidney replacement therapy education. The problem is advanced CKD patients are under a very high risk of competing events, one of them being a pre-KRT death, for instance, which makes it hard to describe the probability that patients in different countries, for instance, will receive education events or vascular access care or even transplant wait listing. So given the lack of prospective data on that, we decided to investigate this using CKDOPPS data, which, as you know, is a cohort well suited to studying the transition into kidney replacement therapy. So the purpose of our study was really to describe the international practice patterns and the probabilities of patients receiving education events or vascular access placement, for instance, when they reach this very advanced CKD stage in different countries. So our primary objective here was to describe the 2-year incidence of kidney replacement therapy and pre-KRT death, as well as practice patterns in planning for kidney replacement therapy among patients with advanced CKD in the CKDOPPS cohort. So in this study, we used the CKDOPPS cohort, which you are all familiar with, basically a prospective observational study following patients with non-dialysis CKD under nephrology care in different countries in the world. For this study, we included patients from the US, from France, and from Brazil. So the key elements of our study design are summarized here in this slide. So we are basically including patients who reached an average eGFR, and this is a 3-month average eGFR lower than 20 ml per minute. And this is the cutoff that we use to define advanced CKD patients here. The consequence of this design is that there are potentially two sub-cohorts here. One of them are those patients who are already with an eGFR lower than 20 when the CKDOPPS study started. So we are calling these patients the prevalent cohort. But we also included patients who were incident, meaning their average eGFR was lower than 20 at a certain point in time when they were already being followed by the CKDOPPS protocol. So we included patients at the time. So the time zero here is when they actually reached this average eGFR lower than 20 ml per minute. We described then baseline characteristics at the time they were included. And then the outcomes we are studying here, kidney replacement therapy, pre-kidney replacement therapy, death, and planning and education events were described during the follow-up of these patients. As I mentioned, the key study outcomes here are outcomes related to transitions of care, so or preparation into kidney replacement therapy. So basically KRT education events. So those are one-on-one sessions that patients received with their providers, discussing modality and receiving education about different aspects of hemodialysis, peritoneal dialysis, and kidney transplantation. The other outcome was the creation of a permanent dialysis access. This was defined by either an AV fistula or graft or a peritoneal dialysis catheter in place. We excluded catheter here from this outcome across countries. So we are only looking at permanent vascular access or peritoneal dialysis access. And the third outcome here is wait listing. So pre-KRT wait listing events as well. So we are counting the event here when the patient is listed for preemptive kidney transplantation. The other endpoints are KRT initiation, which is a composite of starting EMO or peritoneal dialysis or receiving a preemptive kidney transplantation, and pre-KRT death as well. As I mentioned in the background, these patients, all these events, they have competing events associated to them. So when describing those events in the results, we are actually reporting cumulative incidence functions over this 2-year period since these patients reached an eGFR equal or lower than 20 ml per minute during the study follow-up. So here are the overall patient characteristics across countries. So we are included 2,500 patients across different countries here. Important differences in between countries here. So patients in France and the US tended to be slightly older than patients in Brazil. The proportion of patients who are male is higher in France than other countries. Importantly, the eGFR at study inclusion was higher in France than other countries. This will be important when we look at the outcomes here. And the prevalent population was much lower in France as compared to Brazil and the US as well. And in general, the burden of comorbidities is higher in the United States compared to Brazil and France too. So there are important country differences in the population here for this study. So here the first outcome that we looked at, kidney replacement therapy education. As a reminder, this outcome comes from the interval summary data in which the patients report if they ever received a one-on-one section on kidney replacement therapy education, or if they participated in a group class on such event. Here we are reporting events by baseline 1 year and 2 years. In the x-axis, you see different countries, and we are reporting here the cumulative incidence of those events over time. So basically and remarkably, you can see that the number of education events, or at least the number of patients who received at least one education event, is much higher in Brazil, around 75% over 2 years period, compared to France and the US. And actually, the baseline in Brazil starts much higher. So patients, when they reach an eGFR less than 20, most of them, more than half of of this population, actually already received an education event, which is different from France and the United States, as reported here. When we look at the results for permanent access creation, we also tend to see remarkable country differences. For 2 years, and here again, we are talking about AV fistula graft or PD access, we tend to see a higher number of creation of such vascular or PD access on France and the United States as compared to Brazil. And importantly, the rate in France does increase much faster compared to other countries. Again, this starts at when patients reach an average EGFR less than 20, compared to Brazil and the United States, where at least at baseline, we tend to see a slightly higher number of patients who already had a definite access creation by then. And finally here, for kidney transplant wait listing, what we see at 2 years is across countries, we are describing approximately 20 to 25% probability of patients being wait listed over time, which a much lower proportion in Brazil compared to the US and France. And actually France has a slightly higher number of patients wait listed at 2 years compared to other countries as well. In terms of clinical outcomes here, we are also describing important differences in countries. So here we are describing the cumulative incidence event of pre-KRT death, KRT, or those patients who are event-free by 2 years. And we tend to see that in the United States, and this makes sense comparing to the descriptives at baseline I just showed you, we tend to see a much higher number of patients having pre-KRT death. So the competing risk of dying before ever reaching kidney replacement therapy is higher in the US compared to other countries. And also the rate of patients starting either dialysis or receiving a preemptive kidney transplantation is actually higher in the United States. In fact, in the United States, after 2 years, more than half of the population will either have died or transition to kidney replacement therapy, which is a proportion that tends to be lower in France and in Brazil. Also, the EGFR, or the median EGFR at kidney replacement transition, tends to be higher in Brazil compared to France and the US, France having the lowest EGFR among these 3 countries at KRT transition. So a few take-home messages here, and importantly, this project is ongoing. We still plan to report this data in more detail and analyze different outcomes comparing these countries as well. So the key message here is consistent to the dialysis literature. We are looking at important country variations in practice patterns during this transition period to kidney replacement therapy. So a key message is, so first, in Brazil, education events, and these are education events to kidney replacement therapy modalities, tend to be higher in Brazil than in the US and France. The 2-year incidence of permanent access creation is approximately 30% across countries. And the probability of having a permanent access in place before transitioning to dialysis seems to be higher in France and in the US compared to Brazil. And finally, the likelihood of being listed for a preemptive kidney transplant within 2 years is higher in France than in Brazil and the US. Patients in the US tend to have higher risks of both pre-KRT death and initiation of a kidney replacement therapy modality compared to other countries. This is consistent because these patients tend to have a higher comorbidity burden compared to other countries as well. We do believe that additional studies are necessary to evaluate contributing factors to adverse outcomes, and importantly, to better understand barriers to kidney replacement therapy planning and education to assure a smooth transition either to dialysis, either to transplant, or to conservative kidney management. And I'd like to finish giving a special thanks to all the sponsors and partners who support the CKDOPPS cohort. Thank you, and looking forward to the discussion with you all.
Thanks so much, Murilo. This is so exciting to see this data fresh out of the oven, unique too. That I don't think that there's a lot of information there for that population in the later stage. And I'm really looking forward to watching the presentation that Natalia is going to give. This is an oral presentation during the ERDTA in Milan. And you're all welcome to join us in that presentation. And we'll get to the discussion later on. So thanks again. So let's move to the final presentation of today. This is a study that, you know, it's a good reminder of the richness of the DOPS, PDOPS, and CKDOPS studies in terms of capture of patient-reported outcomes. We're not often we think of, you know, how early DOPS has adopted this. Much before people were talking about the importance of PROs, DOPS started to collect data and has been collecting data very consistently until currently. And Antonio Lopes from Brazil is going to present some of the study that is part of an academic exploration of the data, the CKDOPS data, as part of a master degree for Daniela Lopes, which is called Associations Between Functionality and Clinical Outcomes in Patients with CKD. Let's hear from Antonio, and we'll join the discussion in a moment.
I am Antonio Lopes. I will present this study, Associations of Functional Dependency with Health-Related Quality of Life and Mortality in patients with chronic kidney disease in the CKDOPS. Functional status is related to the individual's ability to perform basic activities for daily living and self-care instrumental activities. High prevalence of functional dependency have been reported in maintenance hemodialysis patients. There is evidence that functionally independently maintenance hemodialysis patients have poor health-related quality of life and high mortality. There is a lack of studies in non-dialysis dependent chronic kidney disease patients to assess both the prevalence of functional dependency and its association with the diverse outcomes. We investigate the prevalence of functional dependency and association functional status with health-related quality of life and mortality. The data is from the CKDOPS in international cohorts. Patients with stages 3 to 5 non-dialysis dependent CKD from the United States and Brazil were included in this study. The CATS questionnaire and the Lawton Brody questionnaire were used to assess functional status. Functional score will calculate and they vary from 0 to 13 points and categorized as highly dependent if less than 11, moderate dependently 11 to 13, and independent if 11 points. Outcome variables were health-related quality of life and all-cause mortality. The KDKOL 36 questionnaire was used for the following health-related quality of life measure: mental component summary, MCS, physical component summary, PCS, symptoms problem, kidney disease burden, and the effect of kidney disease. Each score may vary from 0 to 100. High score indicating higher health-related quality of life. Linear models were used for health-related quality of life in Cox regression for mortality. Three groups of models were used with successive inclusion of covariates. Let's see the results. More than half of the patients reported some degree of dependency. Lower functional status was associated with black race, with older age, with diabetes, cardiovascular comorbidities, and female sex. You see the model with a high level of adjustment. You see that be independent, have better health-related quality of life for all measurements of health-related quality of life. The better health-related quality of life for patients that are independent are seen both in patients with glomerular filtration rates lower than 30 and between 30 and 60. This table shows hazard ratios of association between functional status and mortality for the whole sample. Independent patients have lower mortality as compared with highly dependent. And the model with extensive adjustment for covariate. The same is shown for patients with glomerular filtration rate lower than 30 and between 30 and 60. Conclusions. This study show high prevalence of functional dependency in non-dialysis dependent CKD patients. Strong association between functional dependency and mortality in non-dialysis dependent patients were observed even after extensive adjustment for possible confounders. Functional dependency was also associated with poor health-related quality of life. This association did not vary by subgroups of estimated glomerular filtration rates.
Thanks so much, Antonio, for this presentation, and just so nice to see, the work you've been doing across the years, starting with DOPS and now at CKDOPPS. It was a great presentation. We have a few minutes now for a final Q&A about the CKDOPPS session, and then I'll wrap up the presentations for today. So let me just start by doing a sound check here. Everybody who's connected, Lisa, Murilo, Antonio?
Can you hear me well?
Yeah, thank you.
Would you hear me?
Yeah, thank you, Antonio. All right.
Okay. Well,
Lisa?
Okay, yes, so there is a bug and I heard you now.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. Let me start by asking Lisa one question. Lisa, beautiful presentation. Thank you. So that there are two things that in clinic we see as impacting hemoglobin decrease, and that is declining kidney function and also specific clinical events. How do you deal with that in looking at trajectories? In other words, can you say that the relationship with the trajectory is independent of kidney function decline and individual events?
Yes, excuse me, I can't hear all the question because I don't know if there is a bug, but I think your question is the question that is always asked each time I present this work, and how the eGFR is relatively to the hemoglobin. So I don't show the slide here, but we project in each classes there is 5 classes. In each classes we project GFR mean trajectory, and we show that
just a graphical representation, so it's not causation or but we just saw that there is the same pattern between the trajectory of hemoglobin and GFR, and it's not surprising at all since the pathology of anemia in CKD that depends on the kidney function. So that's a result that we wanted to take a look, but not so surprising, I think.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Let me move to Antonio. Antonio, were you surprised when you saw the association between Black race and functional status? I'm a bit surprised about that, aren't you?
Oh, yes. You know, this is pre-dialysis. You see that when they go to dialysis, you see better outcomes in Blacks.
Yeah.
Yes, at least in the US, because you see that Marcelo did some analysis using data for hemodialysis patient here in Salvador, and using this data, you could not show an advantage for Black also here. I'm talking about mortality, you see. I'm not sure, Roberto, if association, even for hemodialysis, you already talk about the pre-dialysis. If you see the same result that you see in the US, I think that will be important. But if yes, I agree with you. I agree with you. If you use the data from the West for hemodialysis patient, you know, but you have that hypothesis that what you see pre-dialysis may be different from dialysis. Maybe one of the reasons for better surviving Black is maybe selection of the ones that have better outcomes, you know.
Yeah. Thanks very much. And Murilo, really quick, final question. Do you think that a lot of this that you see in terms of country variations might be health system related, not necessarily patient or practice level?
Certainly, yeah. I think there are potentially many health system related factors here that will drive differences in these rates that we are describing. Certainly, patient population is different, and as I showed you in the presentation, there are country variations. But I think the key, I would say, mediators of the differences that you're seeing are probably related to health system differences, and this is certainly what we will explore moving forward in this manuscript.
Yeah, thanks very much. Well, thank you, everybody. I'd like to thank the people who attended the session today. I hope you enjoy our updates. I hope you also agree that we do have a robust pipeline of projects that are bringing new and fresh information to the community, and DOPPS continues moving forward really strong. There are a couple of things that I think was interesting today, maybe unique projects looking at discontinuation instead of the initiation of treatments, and looking at changes in some of surrogate outcomes. I thought that was an interesting presentation by Angelo. Also, it's really interesting to see, that some of these changes in practice might be really justifying some of the results that we saw presented by Brian and the PDOPPS. And just wanted to highlight what Mark described, and that is the fact that really PDOPPS brings to PD a unique source of data. There's not enough out there, to look at practice patterns and outcomes in the peritoneal dialysis population. Also unique of DOPPS is the outreach to different areas where really information is very scarce. We heard today data from China, from Thailand, and from Brazil, which are not the countries that usually we see description of practice patterns with lack of registries. And I think DOPPS in general is really helping the developing world also to bring important information. And finally, I think what we saw today something that is also unique for what's one of the first times that we really saw an analysis, and this was presented by Angelo, an interesting analysis of how we can actually use data across the different regions like we did traditionally, but also across the studies. You know, the transfusion rates across the 3 studies using a single way of capturing data offers a really an important advantage of DOPS and the way we are collecting data in a harmonized way. So with that, I wanted to just thank again the audience, thank the presenters, the moderators, for really beautiful presentations and a lively discussion. I invite you all for our event, live event, social event, our social mixer on Thursday in Milan. If you happen to be in Italy, we'll be happy to welcome there and share some time and conversation, and we can continue the discussion there. And with that, I thank again for participation, and I hope to see you in Milan. And I wish you all a wonderful rest of your days. Bye-bye.